In the 5th century BC, Athens was experiencing a golden age of democracy and culture. But behind the scenes, the great Pericles seemed to be under the influence of his wife, the hetaera Aspasia. How could one woman influence decisions that changed the course of history? Today, we'll dive into the world of ancient rumors and facts to uncover whether Aspasia was a true power behind the throne or simply a victim of gossip. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and let's get started. The city of Milos was not like the strict conservative Athens. It was a melting pot of cultures, the Ionian center of philosophy and science, a city where the air was saturated with freedom of thought. It was probably this atmosphere that shaped the character of the young Aspasia. Her father, Axiochus, was apparently a wealthy and progressive man, since he gave his daughter an education that was only available to boys in Athens. She studied rhetoric, logic, and philosophy, sciences that were considered strictly male prerogatives, tools for governing the polis. What made her leave her hometown and go to the heart of Hellas, to Athens? There's no exact info on that. Perhaps she was attracted by the city's fame and intellectual life. Perhaps it was family circumstances. But the fact remains, a young, educated, and ambitious woman arrived in a city where only one social role awaited her, one that allowed her to use her mind and knowledge without being confined to four walls: the role of a hetaera. It is important to understand that a hetaera in 5th century Athens was not simply a woman of easy virtue. Yes, she provided services to men, but that was only part of her life. Unlike Athenian wives, who were practically recluses, and pornae, ordinary prostitutes, hetaeras were educated, independent, and had a unique status. They could own property, move freely around the city, and most importantly, participate in symposia, male banquets that were the centers of political and intellectual life. Imagine a sultry Athenian evening. In the andron, the men's quarters of the house, the most influential people in the city, strategists, philosophers, poets, recline on couches. They drink diluted wine and engage in leisurely conversations about the fate of democracy, the war with Sparta, Sophocles' new tragedy. And among them, as an equal, sits a woman. She is not just a silent beauty pleasing to the eye. She argues with Socrates himself, challenges Anaxagoras' theses, and her judgments on politics are sharp and accurate. This was Aspasia. Her salon quickly became the most fashionable place in Athens. Getting in was a sign of belonging to the elite. Her sharp mind and skill in rhetoric became legendary. Ancient authors, from Plato to Xenophon, mention her in their works, albeit in different contexts. Socrates, the greatest philosopher, is rumored to have come to her himself to learn the art of debate. She was not just a conversationalist, she was a mentor in what the Greeks valued most, the art of persuasion through words. It was in this intellectual environment that Aspasia met the man whose name became synonymous with the golden age of Athens, Pericles. The foremost strategist, leader of the Democratic Party, a man of unquestionable authority. He was older, already married, and had 2 sons. But meeting Aspasia turned his life upside down. Pericles, charmed not so much by her beauty as by her intellect, did something unthinkable at the time. Around 445 BC, he divorced his lawful wife, an Athenian aristocrat, and began living openly with Aspasia. This step was a real challenge to society. Aspasia was a metio, a foreigner, and according to the law which, ironically, Pericles himself had introduced in 451 BC, their marriage could not be considered legal, and their children could not obtain Athenian citizenship. Their union was based not on dynastic or property interests, like most marriages in Athens, but on deep affection and intellectual partnership. Plutarch, who lived centuries later but drew on earlier sources, wrote that Pericles loved her exceedingly and kissed her every day when he left and returned home. For a stern, reserved Athenian politician, such a display of affection was out of the ordinary. This union gave Aspasia something incredible, access to the highest echelons of power. She became the mistress of the foremost house in Athens, but not as a silent shadow. She was his advisor, his confidant. Pericles' enemies immediately took advantage of this, creating a smear campaign around Aspasia. She was accused of all mortal sins, that she wrote speeches for Pericles, that she pushed him toward disastrous political decisions, that her house was not a philosophical salon but an elite brothel where she found mistresses for noble Athenians. They had a son, whom they named Pericles the Younger. His fate reflected his mother's complicated status. As the son of the greatest Athenian leader, he was considered illegitimate by law and had no civil rights. Only at the end of his life, after his legitimate sons died of the plague, did Pericles have to humbly ask the people's assembly to make an exception and grant his son by Aspasia citizenship. Thus, her union with Pericles elevated Aspasia to the top of Athenian society, but at the same time made her the main target for all those dissatisfied with his policies. All the talk about her running Athens originated here, in this union of mind and power. But that does not mean that there was not a grain of truth in these rumors. Aspasia's influence, however, was not direct and formal. She could not speak in the people's assembly or hold public office. Her power was soft, behind the scenes, based on personal authority and closeness to Pericles. Her salon was not just a place to pass the time pleasantly. It was an informal decision-making center, a kind of think tank of Athenian democracy. Here, in an informal setting, Pericles could gauge the mood of the elite and discuss risky ideas that were too dangerous to bring up for public discussion right away. Aspasia, as the hostess and moderator of these discussions, played a key role. She knew how to steer the conversation in the right direction, asking pointed questions that forced her interlocutors to look at the problem from a new angle. Her skill in dialectics, which, according to rumors, even Socrates envied, allowed her to weed out weak arguments and identify the essence of the problem. It was in this salon, according to malicious gossip, that Pericles' most famous and controversial speeches were born. For example, his famous funeral oration, delivered in honor of the first fallen in the Peloponnesian War, became the anthem of Athenian democracy. Ancient authors, such as Plato in his dialogue Menexenus, directly attribute the authorship of this speech to Aspasia, claiming that Pericles merely memorized what she had composed for him. Of course, this is most likely a satirical exaggeration and an attempt to undermine the memory of the great strategist by presenting him as a puppet in the hands of a foreign woman. However, there is no smoke without fire. A more plausible version is that Aspasia took an active part in discussing and editing her husband's speeches. With her impeccable knowledge of rhetoric, she could have helped him refine his wording, strengthen his arguments, and make his speeches more convincing and emotional. She was his first and most biased listener, his main critic and editor. But her influence was not limited to literature. Comedians, the chief investigative journalists of the time, did not mince words in accusing her of direct interference in foreign policy. The most serious accusation was related to the so-called Samos War, 440 to 439 BC. Samos, a powerful ally of Athens, entered into conflict with Miletus, Aspasia's hometown. Athens, led by Pericles, intervened in the war on the side of Miletus, which led to the brutal suppression of the uprising on Samos. Pericles' enemies immediately claimed that he had become involved in this bloody and costly adventure solely at the instigation of his Miletus mistress. Plutarch recounts these rumors, although he himself doubts them. Was it true? Most likely not. Athens' decision was dictated by strategic interests, the desire to maintain control over the Aegean Sea and prevent Samos from growing stronger. But the fact that Aspasia could be considered the cause of an entire war speaks to her enormous, albeit unofficial, influence in Athenian society. She became a convenient figure onto whom any unpopular decisions made by Pericles could be blamed. Another striking example was the Megarian Edict, Pfeffism, around 432 BC. This decree, initiated by Pericles, prohibited merchants from the neighboring polis of Megara from trading in the markets of Athens and its allies. It was a devastating economic blow, which, according to many historians, was one of the main reasons for the start of the Peloponnesian War. Once again, the playwright Aristophanes, in his play The Acarnanians, draws a direct connection. According to him, the war began because some Megarians kidnapped several girls from Aspasia's house. This is of course grotesque and caricatured, but behind this caricature lies a very real public opinion. Aspasia, a foreigner, is dragging Athens into her personal quarrels, and Pericles, who has lost his head over love, is doing her bidding. The attacks on Aspasia culminated in a trial organized by her enemies shortly before the war began. She was accused of asabia, impiety, the most terrible crime in Athens, punishable by death or exile. The formal reason was that she allegedly did not worship the gods and spread godless teachings, probably the ideas of her friend, the philosopher Anaxagoras, who claimed that the sun was a hot stone and not the god Helios. But the real goal was obvious, to strike Pericles through the person closest to him. Plutarch describes this scene with great drama. Pericles, usually reserved and imperturbable, personally defended Aspasia in court and, according to some, shed many tears, begging the judges for leniency. Aspasia was acquitted, but this trial showed how dangerous and influential a figure she was considered to be. Accusations of impiety were a standard political tool for eliminating undesirables. The fact that it was used against a female metic suggests that she was perceived not simply as the strategist's companion, but as an independent political entity, the Grey Cardinal of Athens. After Pericles' death from the Athenian plague in 429 BC, Aspasia's life seemed to be going downhill. She lost her powerful patron and was left alone in a city where many hated her. But she did not break down. On the contrary, her story takes another unexpected turn. According to ancient sources, she became involved with a certain Lysicles, a cattle dealer. He was a man of humble origins, but an ambitious and energetic demagogue politician. And, according to ancient authors, it was Aspasia, thanks to her knowledge and connections, who turned this uncouth merchant into one of the leading politicians of Athens for a time. This story, even if embellished, shows that Aspasia's influence was not merely a reflection of Pericles' power. She herself was a source of power, capable of creating politicians. She outlived not only Pericles, but also her son, Pericles the Younger. His fate was tragic. Having obtained citizenship thanks to his father, he had a brilliant military career and was elected one of the strategists.
But in 406 BC, after a victorious but bloody naval battle at the Arginusae Islands, he and other victorious strategists were accused of failing to rescue drowning sailors and not burying the bodies of the dead. In a fit of populist rage, the People's Assembly, in violation of all laws, sentenced them to death. Thus Aspasia lost her only son. Nothing is known about her last years. She disappears from the pages of history as suddenly as she appeared. What is the secret of her phenomenon? Why was this woman able to achieve such a position in a world where she had no place? First, it was her unique education and intellect. She possessed the tools of influence, rhetoric and logic that were unavailable to other women. Second, it was her status as a hetaera, which, for all its shortcomings, gave her freedom of communication and economic independence. Third, it was undoubtedly her personal qualities, charm, charisma, the ability to understand people and find common ground with them. She was not just smart, she was wise. But the main lesson of her story is how society perceives and describes female power. Since there were no institutions or even conceptual frameworks for direct, legitimate female influence in Athens, any manifestation of female power was immediately demonized. Her intelligence was turned into cunning, her advice into intrigue, her love into witchcraft. The image of Aspasia created by her contemporary enemies is a classic example of how a patriarchal society tries to neutralize a wrong woman by reducing her influence to sexual manipulation and behind-the-scenes conspiracies. She was called the new Omphale, the Lydian queen who enslaved Pericles, and the new Helen, who started wars. Nevertheless, even through this veil of slander and satire, the image of an outstanding personality shines through. A woman who, through the power of her intellect and will, was able to overcome all social barriers and become not just an equal, but a mentor to the greatest minds of her era. She did not rule Greece in the sense that Cardinal Richelieu did. Her power was different, informal, intellectual, but no less real for that. She was the catalyst that accelerated political and cultural processes, the mirror that reflected all the complexity and contradictions of the golden age of Athens. The story of Aspasia is not just the story of one woman. It is a story about the nature of power, about the role of the individual in history, and about how even in the most rigid frameworks there is always room for those who dare to push the boundaries. Immersing oneself in the world of Athenian symposia where Aspasia shone requires a more detailed examination. These were not just drunken orgies, as it may seem to a modern person. The symposium was a complex social ritual, an institution where Athenian culture and politics were forged. It began with libations to the gods, followed by the main part, drinking wine, always diluted with water in a crater, and conversation. Dialogue. The art of dialogue, the ability to defend one's point of view and elegantly refute one's opponent, was highly valued. And this is where Aspasia was unrivaled. Her advantage lay not only in her natural intelligence, but also in her different, non-Athenian approach to thinking. Athenian men, brought up within the framework of strict polis ideology, often thought in a formulaic way. Aspasia, who came from cosmopolitan Miletus, brought a fresh perspective, an Ionian inquisitiveness of mind, unshackled by dogma. She could ask childish questions that stumped the most renowned men, because none of them ever dared to question things that seemed obvious. Imagine a dialogue reconstructed on the basis of references in the works of the Platonists.
Socrates, using his method of maiutics, leads his interlocutor to the realization that he actually knows nothing about the subject of the dispute. Aspasia, according to some sources, used a different method. She did not destroy other people's concepts, but built new, more complex and convincing ones. Her rhetoric was not only analytical, but also synthetic. She could take the disparate opinions expressed during the evening and weave them into a single, coherent concept that reconciled opponents and opened up a new vision of the problem. It was not just the ability to argue, it was the art of managing discussion, of moderation. That is why there was no place for rude quarrels and empty boasting in her salon. She created an atmosphere in which truth was born. And Pericles, observing this, understood that he possessed a treasure. He saw how the most complex political nuts were untangled in the course of these conversations, how his most ardent opponents, falling under the spell of Aspasia's intellect, softened and began to listen to his arguments. Her influence on Pericles can also be traced in the evolution of his own style. Early Pericles was known for his sharpness and uncompromising nature. Later Pericles, nicknamed Olympian for his grandeur and calmness, learned flexibility. He became a master of political maneuvering, able to persuade not by force but by logic. Many historians see in this change the direct influence of Aspasia, who taught him to see problems from different angles and find non-trivial solutions. She was his constant sparring partner in intellectual battles, preparing him for real battles in the People's Assembly.
Before bringing any important bill to the demos for consideration, he would test drive it on Aspasia. She acted as his most nitpicky opponent, finding weak spots in his arguments, predicting possible objections, and helping him find compelling answers to them. It is also worth delving into the economic aspect of Aspasia's life. As a hetaera, she was undoubtedly a wealthy woman. Her salon required considerable expense. But where did she get the money? Sources vaguely hint that she owned a workshop for the manufacture of expensive fabrics and ran a school for other hetaera. This accusation, made by comedians, most likely had a real basis. Aspasia was not only an intellectual but also a businesswoman. She understood perfectly well that in Athens, where the status of women was extremely low, the only guarantee of independence was money. Her school, if it existed, was not just a brothel, as her enemies tried to portray it. Most likely, it was a kind of educational center, where young girls who had chosen the path of a hetaera were taught not only the art of love, but also rhetoric, music, philosophy, everything that constituted the professional set of skills of a high-class hetaera. Aspasia, in essence, created her own kind, forming an elite within her profession, and undoubtedly deriving considerable income from it. This made her even more dangerous in the eyes of conservatives. She was not just a wrong woman, she was an economically independent wrong woman, which destroyed the very foundations of the patriarchal order. Now let's take a closer look at her trial. The charge of Aspasia was extremely serious. Just a few years earlier, her friend and teacher Anaxagoras had been expelled from Athens on the same charge. Another friend of Pericles, the great sculptor Phidias, creator of the statue of Athena in the Parthenon, was accused of stealing gold and died in prison. This was a targeted campaign against Pericles' circle, and the blow to Aspasia was the most painful. The prosecutor was the comic poet Hermippus. This is significant. Comedy was the main mouthpiece of the opposition. Hermippus accused her not only of impiety, but also of bringing free Athenian women together with Pericles. This was a direct accusation of pimping, aimed at humiliating her and portraying her as a libertine who was destroying family values. The drama of the court scene described by Plutarch was not limited to Pericles' tears. Imagine the hetaera, the Athenian jury, consisting of hundreds of ordinary citizens. Before them stood their idol, their leader, the first citizen, Pericles, humbly pleading for a foreign woman of questionable reputation. It was a huge political risk. Anyone else in his place would have disowned such a companion to save his career. But Pericles went all in. His tears were not just a display of emotion. In a culture where public displays of emotion by men were considered a weakness, it was a carefully calculated gesture. He was showing the Athenians, this woman is more precious to me than power, more precious than reputation. By condemning her, you condemn me. And it worked. The Athenians, despite their dislike of Aspasia, were not prepared to lose their leader on the eve of a great war. She was acquitted, but the trial left a deep scar. It showed how vulnerable her position was and how much she depended on her patron. After Pericles' death, her alliance with Lysicles was not simply a story of how she found a new sponsor. It was a masterpiece of political strategy. Lysicles was a representative of the new politicians, demagogues, who replaced the old aristocracy. They had neither noble origins nor a classical education. Their strength lay in their ability to speak to the masses, in populism. Lysicles was rude and uneducated, but he had natural flair and energy. Aspasia saw potential in him. She became his political advisor and image maker. She taught him the basics of rhetoric, advised him on how to present simple populist slogans in a form acceptable to an educated audience, and introduced him to the right people from Pericles' old circle. In essence, she tried to create Pericles 2.0 from the material at hand. And for a short time she succeeded. Lysicles did indeed become a prominent figure in Athenian politics. However, he lacked Pericles' wisdom and strategic vision and soon died in one of the military expeditions.
But this episode itself proves that Aspasia was not just the wife of a genius. She was an independent political player, capable of acting even after the loss of her main support. Finally, it is worth mentioning her influence on philosophy, which is often underestimated. References to her in the dialogues of Plato and Xenophon are no coincidence. For Socrates and his circle, she was not just an exotic interlocutor. She was the bearer of a different kind of knowledge. While the Athenian philosophers focused on abstract concepts of good, justice, and the state, Aspasia, as a woman, was much closer to real, practical life and the psychology of human relationships. In Plato's Menexenus, Socrates ironically says that Aspasia taught him everything he knows about eloquence. Behind this irony lies the recognition that her approach to rhetoric was different, more emotional, more psychological, aimed not only at the mind but also at the listener's feelings. There is even a hypothesis that some of the ideas attributed to Socrates may actually have originated in conversations with Aspasia. For example, his famous thesis that no one does evil willingly but only out of ignorance. This idea, so unusual for the harsh Greek worldview, may have been inspired by the more feminine, empathetic view of human nature that Aspasia brought to the table. She knew better than anyone how passions, ambitions, and delusions influence people's actions, including those of great politicians. She saw the underside of power, hidden from the eyes of ordinary citizens. And she shared this unique knowledge with philosophers, enriching their speculative constructions with living experience. Thus, her salon was not only a political club, but also a true philosophical school, where the synthesis of masculine and feminine, abstract and concrete, Athenian and Ionian worldviews took place. And this, perhaps, is her main, though not always visible, contribution to the golden age of Athens. She was not just a gray cardinal, she was the intellectual heart of the Periclean era. To fully appreciate the scale of her figure, one must understand how alien she was to the Athenian polis. The status of a metic, a foreigner, was not just a legal formality. It meant lifelong belonging to the second class. A metic could not own land in Attica, could not legally marry a citizen, and had no right to vote in the people's assembly. He was a guest, albeit a permanent one, whose presence was tolerated as long as he was useful and paid a special tax, the metoikion. Aspasia was a stranger in two ways, as a metic and as a woman. And this double alienation, instead of breaking her, became a source of her strength. She was free from the shackles that bound Athenian women, from family traditions, from the need to maintain an impeccable reputation for the sake of future marriage, from the burden of being just a link in the chain of citizenship transfer. Her mind was not constrained by the Athenian upbringing, which taught girls only one thing: be silent and obey. She looked at Athens from the outside, seeing its strengths and weaknesses with a sharpness that was inaccessible to the natives. This detachment allowed her to give Pericles advice free of the emotional bias and false patriotism that so often ruined Athenian politicians. She was his external auditor, his independent advisor, whose loyalty belonged not to the Athenian demos, but to him personally. The psychological background of their union deserves special attention. Pericles, nicknamed the Olympian for his composure and detachment, was a deeply lonely man. His public image required constant self-control. He never laughed in public, avoided feasts, and led a secluded life. He was surrounded by associates, flatterers, and enemies, but he could not be completely honest with any of them. Aspasia became the only person with whom he could take off this mask. She was not just a lover or an intellectual sparring partner. She was his psychotherapist. In her presence, he could allow himself to doubt, fear, and make mistakes. She saw not a triumphant strategist, but a man who bore the responsibility for the fate of an entire empire on his shoulders. Their conversations probably touched not only on politics, but also on the nature of power, the burden of fame, and the fear of the masses. She helped him maintain his inner balance in a world where every wrong step could lead to ostracism, exile. Perhaps it was her support that allowed him to survive the most difficult moments, such as at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, when the plague was ravaging the city and the angry Athenians were ready to tear him apart for his failures. She was his safe haven in the stormy sea of Athenian politics, and this emotional dependence made her influence on him virtually limitless. The idea of her school of hetaera also reveals her as a strategist, not just a socialite. If this school existed, its functions went far beyond simple education. It was, in essence, the first female intelligence network in history. By virtue of her profession, a hetaera had access to the homes of the most influential Athenians. She witnessed private conversations, drunken revelations, and secret deals. She heard things that a respectable wife would never hear. Aspasia, teaching her students not only the art of seduction, but also the ability to listen, analyze, and remember, created a unique source of information. These girls, scattered throughout the city, could report to her on the moods of Pericles' political opponents, on conspiracies in the making, on financial machinations. It was a classic spy network operating under the cover of elite leisure. Pericles' power was largely based on his phenomenal knowledge. He always seemed to know his opponent's moves in advance. And it is quite likely that the eyes and ears that supplied him with this exclusive information were the intelligent and beautiful graduates of Madame Aspasia's academy. One cannot ignore her possible influence on the cultural life of Athens, which was no less significant than her political influence. The era of Pericles was a time of the construction of the Parthenon and the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides. Aspasia was personally acquainted with all the creators of this Greek miracle. Phidias was her friend. Sophocles frequented her salon. But her connection with Euripides seems particularly intriguing. It was in his tragedies on the Athenian stage that a new type of woman first appeared. Intelligent, strong, passionate, reflective, and often terribly dangerous. His Medea, his Phaedra, his Electra are not the silent shadows of their husbands. They are personalities capable of deep psychological analysis and decisive, albeit monstrous, actions. Many researchers see in these images a direct reflection of the intellectual revolution that the figure of Aspasia brought about in the minds of the Athenians. She showed by her own example that a woman can be not only an object, but also a subject of action. Euripides, as the most sensitive and radical of the tragedians, grasped this tectonic shift in public consciousness and brought it to the stage, forcing Athenian men to face their hidden fears of intelligent and independent women. It is quite possible that he drew many ideas for his female characters from conversations with Aspasia, the only woman in Athens with whom he could discuss psychology and philosophy on equal terms. To understand what a bombshell Aspasia's appearance was, one must imagine the life of an ordinary Athenian citizen of her age. Her world was confined within the walls of the gynecium. From early childhood, she was taught to weave, spin, and manage slaves. She was never taught to read or write, as this was considered unnecessary and even harmful. At the age of 14 or 15, her father married her off to a man she saw for the first time at the wedding. Her main task was to bear legitimate heirs, primarily sons, who would inherit the property and continue the family line. She could not participate in public life, could not even go to the market. It was not proper for decent people to mention her name in public. In Pericles' famous speech, there is a phrase addressed to the widows of fallen soldiers. The greatest glory for a woman is when men speak of her as little as possible, whether in praise or in blame.
In this world of absolute female silence and invisibility, Aspasia, whose name was on everyone's lips, who was debated in the agora and ridiculed in the theater, was not just an exception, she was an anomaly, a challenge to the very foundations of the universe. The hatred for her on the part of conservatives was caused not so much by her influence on Pericles as by the very fact of her existence. She was living proof that a woman could be equal to a man, and this idea was more frightening to the average Athenian than a Persian invasion. That is why comedy became the main weapon against her. Aristophanes and other comedians created her black legend. They did not just joke, they deliberately struck at the most painful points of Athenian male self-awareness. By calling her Omphale, they hinted that the great Pericles, like Hercules, had become a slave to a woman, fulfilling her whims and losing his masculinity. By comparing her to Helen, they instilled in the ordinary Athenian that because of the whims of one promiscuous foreigner, he was forced to go to war and die. By accusing her of running a brothel, they struck at the most sacred thing, the Athenian family, hinting that she was corrupting their wives and daughters. These images were simple, understandable, and extremely effective. They turned complex political issues into a simple and scandalous story about an aging politician who had fallen under the spell of a cunning courtesan. It was classic populism, and it worked. The image of Aspasia as an intellectual was too complex for the mass consciousness. The image of Aspasia as a libertine and schemer was instantly absorbed. After her death, her figure did not disappear, but moved into another dimension, the philosophical one. Socrates' disciples, Plato and Xenophon, continued to use her image in their writings, but each in their own way. For Xenophon, in his Oikonomia, Aspasia is, oddly enough, a model of the ideal housewife. He puts into Socrates' mouth a story about how Aspasia teaches the art of managing a household, arguing that a good wife should be her husband's partner, not just his property. This was an attempt to domesticate her radical image, to fit it into an acceptable framework. Plato, on the other hand, in Menexenus, is more subtle and sarcastic. He makes Socrates claim that Aspasia is a great rhetorician who wrote Pericles' famous funeral oration. At first glance, this is a compliment, but for Plato, who hated the sophists and their art of rhetoric, it was the highest form of humiliation. He hinted that all of Pericles' glory was just a collection of beautiful but empty phrases composed by a female sophist. He used her image as a club to strike at Athenian democracy, which he despised. Thus, even after her death, Aspasia remained a battleground, a symbol that every ideological party tried to appropriate and use for its own purposes. This is perhaps the best proof of the magnitude of her personality. Ordinary hetaera were forgotten the day after their death. Aspasia, on the other hand, was still being interpreted, appropriated, or debunked even decades later, because her life posed questions to the Greek world for which it had no ready answers. Another subtle tool of her influence was her ability to shape public opinion through fashion and aesthetics. In an era when appearance was inseparable from social status, Aspasia's salon set trends not only in philosophy but also in style. She introduced Ionian refinement into Athenian life, lighter fabrics, elaborate hairstyles, refined manners. This was not mere embellishment. By creating an aura of cultural superiority and sophistication around Pericles, she indirectly legitimized his power in the eyes of the aristocratic youth, who were always drawn to the new and fashionable. By supporting the artists and sculptors of Phidias's circle, she became an informal minister of culture, directing state funds to projects that glorified not only Athens but also her patron personally. Thus, every new temple and every statue became silent witnesses to her taste and, consequently, her influence. Her possible contribution to the development of medicine is also interesting. Hippocrates was part of her circle, and some ancient sources attribute knowledge of obstetrics and gynecology to Aspasia. Aspasia probably did not rule ancient Greece in the literal sense, but her mind and position allowed her to leave a noticeable mark on history. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and see you again in the world of myths and their hidden truths.